It's my pleasure to invite up our first panel. The goal of this panel will be to take stock of the political stock of the Common Core. And keeping our speakers on speaking terms is Andrew Ujifusa of Education Week. Andrew covers state policy for Education Week. That work includes following legislation, policy trends, also lots of interesting political fights. If you're not reading State Ed Watch, you should be. It's a great blog. He also does a lot of excellent, full-blown stories for Ed Week. He's really closely covered the rollout of the Common Core standards and tests. He previously worked for newspapers in Maryland and Mississippi, and he actually taught high school English in Japan. So Andrew, I'd invite you up with your panelists. Thanks.
So I just thought I would sort of set the stage a little bit by turning back to something that, appropriately enough, a former public editor of the Education Writers Association wrote back in June of 2010. And this is something by Linda Perlstein. And the title of what she wrote was a very short item on EWA's website. She wrote a blog item called "Why Almost Nobody is Writing About the Common Core." Can you believe it? Some of what she wrote includes, she wrote, in an attempt to answer this question, she wrote, "Standards are boring. What's on the benchmark test? What's in the district curriculum, if there is one? This is what determines what happens in a classroom every day." She also wrote, "Maybe it is just too removed, the question of whether and how much Common Core standards will change curriculum, teaching, and testing." And she was trying to tell reporters, write about the Common Core where it impacts schools, but, quote, "I don't, however, sit around wishing we had more coverage of the politics of standards." So that was 2010. Here we are in 2015, where the Back to the Future movies promised us we'd have flying skateboards and pizzas that cook in 5 seconds. Instead, we have this very political debate about the Common Core. So just a quick rundown, because we actually, even inside the Ed Week office, we ask each other about these numbers all the time. So by our count, 43 states and the District of Columbia are using the Common Core standards in some fashion. Minnesota only uses the English language arts portion of the standards. 3 states have repealed it: Indiana, Oklahoma, and South Carolina. Although in South Carolina, their new standards don't kick in until next year. So there's that little wrinkle. And states that are reviewing the Common Core in some fashion include North Carolina, Missouri, and Maine, as well as Tennessee. So that's a quick statistical rundown for you. So I just thought, we would start with the most basic question of, where are we in terms of debates at the state level, and how teachers and other folks are impacting those debates. Where is the political momentum, and what is your evidence for saying so? Mary Cathryn, why don't we just go down the line and start with you?
Great, okay. So I'll start with just discussing first, where are the debates nationally and the political momentum. And actually, a number of you, I've actually, having read your reflections on this, and a lot of the reporting on the national debate is we're having a discussion about Common Core state standards and their adoption, or in some cases, states are having visceral discussions about their repeal, and at the end of the day, the discussion is incredibly hyper-political, and there's not a lot of discussion about actual teaching and learning. And so there is a huge disconnect. So there certainly are teachers, there are educators having debates about common standards, and specifically about the Common Core state standards, and you can peel that back, and you can even see, very deliberate conversations about the early learning portion of those standards, that sort of thing. But what is really sort of sucking all the oxygen out of the room is the political side of the debate. And should we have common standards, and who has dictated those common standards, and who is behind those common standards? It really helped for me to see the Politico story actually earlier this week that talked about the misinformation that actually seems to be pervading the debate about the standards nationally. And then you see that in different states. Minnesota does not seem to have my home state does not seem to have the same level of attention to the standards that we're seeing in other states. Louisiana sort of being one example where I'm starting to see on the Twitter that they're actually sponsoring tweets about repealing the standards, and that's sort of the level it's gotten, where we're trying to distill the debate down to 140 characters, and there's not a lot of teaching and learning actually in that discussion, and that's disturbing to me as a teacher, and as certainly someone who represents teachers as well, that the debate actually seems to be so hyper-political that we're not actually talking about teaching and learning.
And I think that poll, maybe to show further how hyper-political it is, the poll also suggested that some of the same misperceptions that drove opposition among Republicans to the Common Core increased support among Democrats because they thought that Republicans believe this, but I like it, so it must be good. So the support went up among Democrats, the more misbeliefs they held about it. So that was an interesting sidelight to that poll. Mike, what does that suggest to you?
Yeah, I mean, look, if you step back and you look at the polls, and if you follow Twitter, and if you ever watch Fox News, or if you listen to the debates, the presidential candidates that are starting to run, you would think, oh my God, this thing has become so unpopular. There's so much backlash. Surely half the states must have pulled out by now, right? We pulled a group of political reporters together yesterday who are covering the campaigns, and increasingly as a part of that, talking about the Common Core, and you could just see their eyes open up when we said, no, we've lost one state, Oklahoma. That's it. There's these handful of other states that are reviewing the standards. We still have Mississippi, Idaho, Wyoming, Montana, on and down the list of very red states that are still moving ahead with the Common Core. And that, of course, is not the perception. And to me, the interesting question is, how the heck has that happened? How is it that in the face of such a fierce backlash, especially on the right, that you still have these conservative states in line? And by the way, obviously, look, I'm a strong supporter of the Common Core. I'm the Republican they send to red states to defend the Common Core. That's why I have these cowboy boots that I bought. They come in very handy. They help.
Very nice.
Thank you. Yeah, they're slippery in snow. It turns out. Yeah. That's what did cowboys not have to go in the snow? Is that what's up with that? I don't get that. What is it with the standard? It's an issue. So, so to me, the interesting political story is sort of the dog that didn't bite. That we still are seeing this policy show great resilience, even in the deep red states. And I think that is largely for the political reason. It's because the business groups have really stood up in state after state and said this is something they care about. And they made it clear to their friends in the legislature and in the governor's mansions, their Republican friends, that it's something they care about. And they're watching these votes, and they don't get a free pass on this. And these are the business groups that write the checks for the campaigns and that wield a lot of political power. So this is an issue that's clearly dividing the Republican Party between the Tea Party base and the Republican business wing. And that's why it makes for such an interesting story as the presidential election heats up.
So, but Dan, I want to turn to you because I think there is a sentiment among some state lawmakers, the guys you follow, that as the Common Core was being adopted and implemented, that in many places they were left out of that process. They saw governors and state chiefs being involved in the creation of the standards, state boards adopting them, and it seems as though some of them are saying, well, shoot, those are political actors too, just like me, and they were involved on the front end. What about me? So how much of that sentiment do you see, and where do you see it manifesting itself in state legislatures?
So, this goes, one quick side note. There's a big political controversy going on in Wyoming to the north about a sheriff who's requiring all of his deputies to not wear cowboy boots anymore because if they're slipping around trying to help you. Anyway,
Interesting.
Anyway,
Good.
but
And why doesn't that get any attention? What is that with that?
why not?
Come on.
So this is an issue that I've been. It's a question I had when I first started covering the Common Core. Why aren't legislatures more aggressive about looking at how it was adopted? If they were so upset about it, why not look at the procedures by which they were adopted? And I don't want to bore you with the APA, with the Administrative Procedures Act, by which many states adopted the Common Core. But that's where a lot of the battle lines are happening for legislators. And there's been, I think, around 15 states that have actually now amended the processes by which standards will be adopted in the future. to include more legislative input, more parental input, create panels to review standards before they're finally adopted, etc. Does that answer your question?
It does. It does. Deven, what are you seeing, especially from your home base in Oklahoma, where there's been a bit of controversy?
So Oklahoma was in many ways ground zero for opposition to the Common Core, and it was one of the few places where it was actually successful in the repeal effort. The only place where it was completely successful, I'd argue. My take on the endeavor more generally is that the wave of opposition, at least politically, is crested. We have now 43 states that still have the standards in some form, and I think that going forward there will still be some discussions in state legislatures about repeal, but I think overall the debate is moving on. I think there's 3 reasons why it has why the debates, and my evidence for that is the recent votes in South Dakota, Arizona. Republican legislatures could not pass legislation to repeal the Common Core. And I think there's 3 reasons. One is they've seen difficulties in places like Oklahoma. So Oklahoma repealed the standards. They lost their No Child Left Behind waiver as a consequence. They have to develop a new set of standards. All of that, it takes a lot of work, a lot of effort, and states are seeing how much work and effort is required and the question's a cost-benefit one, right? Are the benefits, the political benefits of repealing the standards worth all of the additional work that has to be accomplished? The second, I think, is supporters of the Common Core have become more effective on both sides. The business community and the Republican Party that Mike was referring to has become more vocal, and educators who support it have also become more vocal as well, and that has played a role in my view. And the third reason, I think maybe the most important reason, is we're moving away from looking just at the standards as something that's kind of nebulous and not really tangible to many people, to everything that accompanies it, right? So now we're talking about assessments. Those are starting to be implemented in states. We're talking about teacher evaluations on the basis of those assessments. And so the debate is moving away from these kind of less tangible standards and to more tangible components of the policy that accompany it: assessments, evaluation, accountability, and those sorts of things.
Yeah, I was saying recently that if you ask almost all parents, the parent doesn't know what a standard is,
No.
but they sure as heck know what a test score is, and they've become used to that over many years. Apologies to folks at EWA who've heard me tell this joke before, but there's an expression that every time you have a fight with your spouse or a significant other, the fight is really about something else, entirely different from what you're actually fighting about. So, and I think you touched on it, Derek. Deven, excuse me. Where do you see the Common Core debate really manifesting itself in other policy areas? Where the debate has sort of spilled over, not so much about the standards, but into areas like testing, which is, I think, the biggest area that we could talk about. Where do you see it spilling over?
Go ahead. Well, I'll just say, on the right, I'll keep doing my job as sort of explaining the right to the media. Okay, I said yesterday and got quoted saying that, the opposition came down to 2 words: Barack Obama. Many people on Twitter were not happy with me about saying that it's much more than that. But look, on the right, this has largely been about the federal role. And my experience has been going into states, in the red states especially, that most of the backlash, most of what the legislators were talking about, most of what the Tea Party people were talking about was the sense that the federal government was making states do this. And there is some legitimacy to that because of the race to the top provision 5 years ago that provided this very strong incentive for states to adopt the Common Core. And so for a lot of conservatives, principled conservatives, that was a deal breaker, that the Fed should have no role in anything touching standards. Now, I think sometimes that federal role has been misrepresented and made to be bigger than it really is, that this was a state-led effort to begin with. It's back to now being a state decision. But that's what this is about. And from a conservative perspective, look, there's a lot not to like about federal intrusion in all kinds of areas over the past 6 years. And of course, that's about Obamacare. That's about, issue after issue, where there's a sense among conservatives that the federal government has gotten too involved and that the executive branch, that the president has overstepped his bounds. And so this has been just, another example. And so, when we heard earlier from the dean, from Paul, that, people have these heuristics and they kind of lump all these issues in together, from conservatives as, here's just another example of Barack Obama, not respecting states' rights, not respecting Congress, doing what he wants. So that's a lot of what that issue is on the right.
Just to provide a quick proof point on that there is a legislator I spoke to that from Oklahoma who was supportive of the Common Core, and he highlighted that very issue that because they were endorsed by the Obama administration, it created a perception among his colleagues that it was unsurmountable.
Yeah.
I would just add, because I actually think your analogy is kind of an apt one, where if we're having this argument about the Common Core state standards, what is actually really behind it? And I actually think given the professional development the deep dive you're taking today as reporters is a great example of one of the other arguments, right? You are actually spending more time discerning and learning about the Common Core state standards today than many of our teachers have experienced in their professional development. I was talking with one teacher before I came here, and if he hadn't attended AFT's Teach, which sure is a shameless plug, I apologize.
That's okay.
But if he hadn't attended that professional development conference 2 years ago, he would have had a total of, as an English language learner teacher, he would have had a total of 45 minutes from his school district on background knowledge on the Common Core state standards before being asked to, here, modify these for your English language learners. And so I think when you hear some of these arguments around the Common Core, and Michael actually wrote a really interesting piece with that series of questions you had, exactly which standards are you against, which ones, tell me, are you against the
I believe
standards?
it's on your tables.
Okay, great.
The 9 questions, as Mike called them.
So I think your question is a really good one. And peeling back, when you hear someone who is opposition, who has a lot of opposition or is even just skeptical, to dig into where that skepticism is. And it may, from a teacher's perspective, if they can name a standard that they're the early childhood ones have gotten a lot of attention, but if they can name a standard, I'm a 7th grade, middle school English teacher by trade, right? And if I could name an 8th grade English standard that I feel is just out of line, well then, okay, you found the kernel of my argument. But if you find that it is about the fact that, this was I got a website given to me, coursestandards.org, and said, here's what we're teaching from starting this year. That, it may very well be someone who feels incredibly unprepared to shift from one set of academic standards to another. The argument could very well be the technology, the experiences they've had with, either seeing their school district go from, again, scraping by, parsing out money for this and that, and suddenly coming up with tons of money they're putting into their technology so that they can take these assessments. Well, okay, so let's separate the actual work of common standards with the real technology concerns you may have. Or it may be seeing that infernal sign in the front of your school's library technology center saying, closed for testing for the next 3 weeks, closed for testing for the next 6 weeks. And again, so now let's separate the real work of teaching to common standards from the idea that you have been locked out of perhaps a multi-million-dollar resource in your school building for 6 weeks, and and you're preparing kids for History Day, and you're preparing kids for their, for teaching to standards about research, and you're locked out of that. And so I do really think that your point about peeling back what the argument really is really important, because you can, I am all for separating out those arguments. You want to have an argument with me about whether we should be as teachers, we should be teaching to common standards or not? I am happy to have that discussion with you. And if it is really about something else, then boy, let's dig into that and let's figure it out, because we actually may have a lot of common cause on what that other issue is.
I think that's a good point. I do think that with the testing issue, which is where a lot of you are now approaching this in terms of your reporting, it is something where for the folks who support the Common Core movement, and this goes back, you could argue, 25 years in terms of a push for a broader set of standards around the country, for the testing piece of that to become jeopardized and to become fragmented, as we've reported over the last couple of years, I think that is a challenge, a concern for folks who support the movement and as using the tests as a way to attack the standards. Dan, is that how folks are looking at it in many states? It's sort of, well, if the business community doesn't want us to get rid of the standards per se, maybe we can get at it through the test. Does that resonate with what you're hearing?
Well, yeah, I actually had one legislator call me last week, and he expressed what I think many legislators are going through, and that is the difficulty in disentangling what is the standards and what is the test at this point. And when they hear the Common Core, many of them think of it as one thing and one. So now, as legislators are getting down into the nitty-gritty of what standards are, because they weren't really involved in the adoption of them. So now that they're interested and their constituents are pushing them to be interested, they're starting to disentangle that, and their approach to the assessments comes largely now out of the fiscal concern, and so the drive away from the consortium, the two major consortia exams have been in part some driven by the state departments of education, but where it has been the legislatures, where that's actually happened in a few states, it's been sometimes a concern over just the fiscal impact, which is what legislators are concerned about. They're passing the budget. But when they hear that they have a good test, and we talk about what next generation assessments are, that's appealing. That is appealing. But there is, of course, the bottom line for legislators.
So I think there's I think the assessments are the most important aspect of the Common Core standards in a lot of ways. And I think one really interesting story that you all could write would point out that we used to make comparisons on the basis of NAEP, right? When we still do, where we have a single test, but we have different standards. Now under the Common Core, where we're heading to a situation where we have the same standards in 40 plus states, but we're gonna have a lot of different tests. I mean, there's still some states in a good number of states in Smarter Balanced, 18, 10 in Park, but there's a lot of states who are doing their own thing. And so I think an interesting question is it better from a comparison perspective to have the same set of standards in several different tests versus what we had with NAEP previously, and we spent all the political capital and fiscal capital getting there.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And the map that I handed out before I started on your table, that map is going to be more fragmented next year in 2015-16 as more states move away from the consortium test. And this year, a majority of students, according to our calculations, will not be taking a consortium test. Now, I think folks like Mike would say,
I can say it if you want. I'm right here.
I'll let you get to other points. But I think folks like Mike would say, well, compared to where we were 6-7 years ago, to have that many students taking some form of a common test, hey, that's pretty good. That's progress. And I think that would be a fair point. But compared to where we were, say, 3 to 4 years ago and what folks were thinking about in terms of how many kids are going to be taking these tests, I think it is a step back. And the question is are states going to continue stepping back, or will there be some sort of consolidation where folks can say, now that is real, tangible progress that is going to stick? So I guess, I don't know if any of you have explored the question. This is sort of a political question of, we have a couple of examples of states, Kentucky and New York, that have dealt with how to report and how to deal with these test scores with the public, and trying to explain to the public, parents, teachers, school boards, whoever, what the test scores mean. And in Kentucky, I think it's fair to say it has gone relatively well. They've now had 3 years of Common Core line test scores. In New York, I think it's fair to say it has been rough. So what lessons should we draw from that, and what are the difficulties in terms of states trying to deal with this, something they have not really had to deal with, some of them maybe ever, in terms of what these test scores actually mean for their students?
I've got a 2-word answer again. Teacher evaluations. Okay, that's the difference between Kentucky and New York, not their communication efforts. They have very similar communication efforts out there telling people, hey, the test scores are going to drop. That's because the standards are higher. The reason there's huge backlash in New York, in my opinion, is because of the teacher evaluations. It's because Cuomo has refused to back down on tying these brand new tests to teacher evaluations, and that has sparked all kinds of anger among teachers, and in my opinion, rightfully so. You know, that we're asking teachers to do something very new and very hard. This is not the time to also be saying we're going to introduce brand new teacher evaluations and hold over your head the fact that you could get fired if your test scores don't go up high enough. In Kentucky, They took that off the table. And that to me is the issue. Why is it in New Jersey that we've got the unions there running ads against Park? Well, look, I think, again, back to your point about, couples squabbling and it's about something else. It's not about Park fundamentally. It's about the teacher evaluations. It's about teachers not wanting to feel like their jobs are at risk because of test scores. And so I think the places that have been smart enough to say we're going to have a pause on teacher accountability, we're going to get to that later, we're going to allow this to play out, we're not going to have these two huge reforms bump into each other at the same time, are going to have more success. That said, I don't think the unions, no offense, should be let off the hook here. I mean, telling parents you should opt your kids out of taking the test, to me, is an awful lot like telling parents they should opt their kids out of vaccines. It may or may not hurt their own child, but it's not good for the common good because it means that we won't have good information about how our schools are performing, and that's going to particularly be bad for our disadvantaged kids.
That is a highly charged analogy or comparison.
And granted, that was longer than a 2-word answer, I will admit.
That's okay. Let's focus on the last part of it. Mary Cathryn, is that a fair comparison? Is it the teachers union agitating against this in some states that is really threatening to undermine it? What's your response to that?
Yeah, no, I appreciate you asking. I have a couple different responses. First of all, the disconnect, and where you can imagine we have a lot of agree, disconnecting the test scores from an evaluation is an important part of gaining confidence in a system. It really is. That does not mean, and I really want to stress this, that does not mean that teachers aren't accountable for that pausing period. Right? We have had teacher evaluations longer than we've had these reported test scores. We've had varying degrees of people like flexing the muscle of a teacher assessment, or a teacher evaluation, of course. However, teachers can still be very accountable to their students and to their, the system they're hired into. At the same time that you are saying we want to gain confidence in the system, so while we deal with the tests we're going to use or the hiccups in the reporting or everything else, we're still going to use a teacher evaluation system that relies more heavily on other sorts of feedback. Right. So there's no break really from being held accountable to meeting the needs of my students. So that that doesn't very often get elevated in a conversation about let's put the brakes on the high stakes, right? So I would like to elevate that some more. One of the other things another frustration that teachers have felt for a long time, as there has been more and more attention put to the test results. What we have seen as teachers is less and less attention put to the assessments we're giving students on a regular basis. And the things often in 13 years of parent-teacher conferences I find myself talking about with parents or family members and students is the actual work they're doing for me that I can put in front of them. We can talk about the progress they've made in their writing, or the lack of it, etc. And we see that incredible imbalance. Everyone pays attention to these test scores. No one is paying attention to the fact that we're regularly giving feedback to students.
And you're talking about not just statewide assessments, right? You're talking about the assessments that districts give.
Right. The assessments I'm building, or perhaps I'm even building with my English language arts team to give to students, that then feeds into their GPA, that then feeds into lots of other systems that students feel very accountable to themselves. Right. That score they're getting back on their piece of writing they turned into me, they feel very accountable to that. And so we feel like that is incredibly rich information. If we put the time and resources into focusing on that information and focusing on our job as a teacher to offer high quality and timely feedback to our students and to their families, that would be an outstanding school transformation, quite frankly. So that does lead to, when you see opt-out conversations, I do see that as different, because I would not characterize them the same as vaccines, because I see this as something where I am still getting something I value from, as a parent, from my teachers and from my child. They can talk to what they're doing here. This score I get back 4 days later, 4 weeks later, 4 months later, whatever. This is not influencing my thoughts around the school experience I have had this year. The on-the-ground experience, the way I feel engaged as a parent or not engaged as a parent. The way I feel communicated with my teachers, or the way I'm feeling not communicated with. Those are real measures and those are the decisions, or those are the experiences parents are using to make decisions about their school system.
So when a local or state collective bargaining unit says, if not pushing parents outright to opt out, saying, well, talk about it, maybe, I mean, what is your basic response to that? What is it? It's sort of, well, it depends on their state circumstances, or that's not a good idea. I mean, there's sort of either you opt out or you don't, right? If you're a parent, so where do you sort of come down on that?
I think you should have the right to opt out. If that, and that becomes that decision you need to make. I think and at the same time, I'm asking people, so what measurements are you using to feel like the needs of your child are being met? And if this is not something where you feel like your child's needs are being met, then you should have the right to opt out.
But I just feel like the hypocrisy here is that educators for over a decade have been asking for better tests, and for good reason, because a lot of the tests we used under No Child Left Behind, as Linda Perlstein wrote in her book, and others have made this strong case, were just terrible tests, and they encouraged terrible kinds of teaching and learning in the classroom. So now the policymakers have responded and invested all this time and energy into coming up with next generation assessments. Now, we're not sure that these are going to be that they're going to deliver everything they've promised, Park and Smarter Balance, but this is our chance to find out. So at this moment, say we're finally moving away from those bad tests to better tests, we're going to encourage people to opt out. I just think that is a lot of hypocrisy. And let's be honest, it is because of the link to teacher accountability, in my opinion. And the vaccine point, again, is that, look, when you don't have your child vaccinated, you do create some additional risk for your own child. But what you mostly do is create a lot more risk for vulnerable people in your community. Right, that's the vaccine thing, and in the same thing here. Okay, maybe your kid may or may not benefit from taking this test. Okay, but the community as a whole definitely benefits from knowing which schools are performing at a high level and which ones are not. And if enough parents opt out, we don't have that information, and it will likely be the most vulnerable members of our society who will not get that information.
There are multiple measures of determining whether a school is a strong school in your community, though. I mean, we do still have graduation rates. We do still have student attrition rates, or student transient rates. We do still have population. Whether there are waiting lists.
But that's pretty radical. I mean, we've had a consensus in this country now for 20 years that we are going to measure schools in large part by outcomes. Now, graduation rates are good outcomes, but if you're talking about an elementary school, how do we measure an elementary school? Now, I think it should be based on growth. It should be progress over time, individual level, all that kind of stuff. But you're taking away that information, and it's hard not to see that as just a ploy to hide bad school performance. That's what's going to happen in New Jersey if the unions there are successful.
Mike, I'm going to harp on this a bit more, because you have said, correct me if I'm wrong, but you have said the federal government should not be in the business of mandating teacher evaluation systems.
Right.
On the other hand, if the issue was so crucial, perhaps, maybe I'm being a bit obtuse, but the federal government should be involved. If that's really the crux of it, shouldn't the federal government step in and say, no, this is what you need to do to ensure that good information gets out?
Well, the federal government, I think, has a role in saying that there should be annual testing, and that states have to do that, and that information should be released, and that information should be transparent. Okay, that's at the school level. I don't think there's a federal role, and by the way, it's clear with the debates on the Hill that there's no sitting member of Congress who thinks there should be a federal role in mandating teacher evaluations. And again, I'm sympathetic to the argument that we should not be doing these test-based teacher evaluations in a very punitive way right now. I totally agree with that. Okay, but to encourage parents to opt out is in my opinion, very dangerous, because what it could mean is if this catches fire, all of these efforts to try to be able to give the public good information about school performance is going to go away. It's like if police officers were standing up saying, you know what, we're going to stop reporting crime data, or we're going to try to sweep that under the rug. That, to me, is what's happening here. It's an attempt to sweep information about school performance under the rug, and that's a big problem.
The analogies continue apace. Yeah.
Can I bring up an issue that...
Yeah, this is how you win Twitter, Andrew, okay? This is how you do it, baby. Come on.
The one issue that very may well come up in your states is if one of these slews of bills that we've seen this year around parent opt-out, to provide the parents the right to opt out of a summative assessment, and we see, wouldn't it be this year, but the next year, the 2015-16 school year, a large portion of parents opting their children out, and they drop below the certain federally required threshold of, depending on whether you have a waiver or you're still under the obligations of No Child Left Behind, 95% of children need to have taken the summative assessment for the assessments to be considered valid under federal law. And there's not really good or clear indication from the U.S. Department of Education how they may respond to those states where the testing population dips below a certain threshold.
Perhaps they're being intentionally vague.
So I want to expand on something Mike just touched on, and that is an issue that might seem on its surface pretty irrelevant to Common Core in your states, but I think actually has huge implications, and that's reauthorization of No Child Left Behind. That's going on right now in Congress, as many of you are probably aware, and if it gets reauthorized, which is a big if, the question isn't if power will be returned to states for accountability and teacher evaluation. The question is how much. And if that happens, if that power is returned, these legislatures are going to be faced with a whole lot of questions that they haven't faced since before No Child Left Behind. How are they going to design their accountability systems? Do they want to have a teacher evaluation system statewide? What is their assessment and technology policy going to look like? And they're going to be faced with integrating all of those things with the Common Core, if they have the Common Core in place. And so in some ways, it will take the debate, in my view, the debate over having the Common Core standards off the table, because they'll just be preoccupied with all these other larger issues that they will be faced with if ESEA, if No Child Left Behind, is reauthorized. So I think that could provide a huge set of stories for you all to look into if that is to come to pass.
I think that's a really good point. I'm looking at the summer of this year when the test scores come out in most states, and sort of that seems to me to be the inflection point when this could all go south going into next year, or maybe the furor blows over and we go into 2016 without this as a major issue. Nobody, I think, has the answer to that, how it's going to go, but I'm interested to hear everybody's thoughts on how it might go. What would be sort of the key sort of signal flares as to, okay, this is really in trouble, or okay, we've passed through the storm on this and we're basically moving ahead at a broad level. What does that look like to folks?
I'll go really quickly because in the summer, most state legislatures will be out of session and it's not an election year, so I'm kind of like out of the game.
Thank you very much.
Nice. You can take this on.
Well, so maybe it's not an election year for state legislators, but I think we're going into a summer where we're going to have a much finer point on presidential election candidates, right? Presidential candidates, and so I actually don't see this discussion necessarily waning, and I think it's going to actually become more important to sort of put a finer point on your earlier question, and is there an argument bubbling that is actually a conflation of something else? So to Devin's point about even if a parent opts out, they're not opting out of the Common Core state standards. They may be opting out of a test that they actually think is a poor measure of their child's learning. So going back to when this summer, I think, since there will be people trying to make sure that their platform is understood, they are trying to gain support behind what they feel their platform's going to be going forward into a presidential election cycle, that they're actually going to be trying to build support for that. And so I actually feel like the atmosphere for conflating things is actually going to get messier than cleaner.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, think about this. The first Republican debates are in August. That's when we expect these test score results back, probably from Park and Smarter Balance. So that's going to be interesting. And among other things, it's going to be interesting because a lot of these folks are sitting governors. So that'll be also interesting when the news comes out that only a third of their kids pass the tests, things like that. But let's also not skip over this period right now, Andrew. A lot of us have been worried about right now, about when Park and Smarter Balanced are first used, that we were going to have an Obamacare website problem. And Patrick had a great story out of Cleveland last week that looked at how Park is going in Ohio. It's one of the first states using Park, and there were some hiccups, but it seemed to be relatively minor. By the way, the Obamacare website broke again last week, so that was interesting. So I think it is fair to say that so far, at least, Park is not having an Obamacare website problem, and that's huge, because if it had, and if it does still, or if Smarter Balance stuff is, the stuff just doesn't work. That's a huge problem. If we get past that hurdle, that's a pretty big milestone.
I want to agree with Mike on that. I think that the actual testing process will be a more important determinant of whether there's opposition fueled by assessments than the actual scores themselves. I think the general public doesn't always have a great understanding of what the scores mean, how if they're gone up or down, but they know if the test didn't go off well, right? That creates the furor, and so I think that will be a better indicator of if we're going to get blowback on the assessment side than the actual scores.
Well, and to that point then, what you're going to see this spring as students are getting tested in some of these things, you're going to start seeing those anecdotal stories come out of, my students took 45 minutes to log on, and then it was lunchtime, and then, we're going to hear these stories sort of popping around the country, and, people are going to go onto them. There are going to be more walking, talking pineapples, some stories, and so
Folks are going to feel the backlash from that, I think, depending on where they happen and how often.
and that will then feed into the timeline Michael just gave about debates.
But I do hope everybody looks at Patrick's reporting on this. It was just great. And sorry to keep putting you in the spotlight, but, also did some great stuff on social media saying, give us your stories, tell us how it's going. We want to hear from the front lines and what you're hearing as kids are taking these tests for the first time. So those are great stories to do over the next couple of weeks for sure, and months.
Okay. Questions from reporters in the room? And if you could just, before you ask your question, if you could identify yourself again, your name, your outlet, that would be great.
Thanks. I'm Patrick O'Donnell from the Cleveland Plain Dealer. A question for Mary. What states are the unions urging kids and parents to opt out of the test? And does AFT have a position on the opt-outs?
Well, I would say AFT's position is that we support parents' right to opt out. I don't, off the top of my head, know of any place where the state union is moving that at the legislature. I think they're supporting lots of grassroots efforts. I think there's one right here in Jefferson County, is that right?
Douglas County.
Outside.
Douglas?
Douglas may have a different sort of opt-out, but I thought there was some work in Jefferson County, so I may be getting those.
Well, we just had talk about New Jersey and the ads and urging parents to opt out. So, I have not followed New Jersey's case closely enough. Is AFT part of that?
I have not seen one of those ads, so I apologize. I can do a quick Google search and find out. But I'm not. I haven't been brought into anything, into any decision making. So sorry, I don't have.
It sounds like you're saying AFT, to your knowledge, is not involved in that particular campaign.
Right.
Okay.
I will double check.
But you also haven't come out and said, we think that kids should take these tests. It'd be great to have you or Randy or Lily come out and say, you know what? These are public schools. The public has a right to know how public schools are performing, and parents, it's your civic duty to have your kids take these tests.
I can't.
You can't in good conscience do that? Why?
Well, because if I am going to use like my place to encourage parents to do anything, I'd be like, visit your child's school, spend time there, talk to your child's teacher, encourage strong parent engagement so you understand how your child's teacher is holding your child to high standards and getting them there. Those are such rich conversations, and those are the conversations that move kids, and those are exciting to me. If I were to put, again, we have what the daily needs a teacher is supposed to meet of students, and we have an annual assessment. And if I were to put my energy into something, it would be to encourage that those daily needs of the daily meeting the needs of students is where I would put my energy in making that the most rich experience that students and families can have with their teachers.
Other questions in the back? Oh no, already with the microphone.
Hi, Lillian Manjo with the Hechinger Report. We're finding a lot of, this is in our comments section and in op-eds and all this, like a lot of misunderstandings about, one, the Common Core itself, and then two, the sort of difference between the Common Core as a set of standards and the testing, and like those are getting conflated all the time, which we've been talking about a little bit. I'm just constantly looking for good ways to, as a journalist, parse that with our readers without coming across, like I feel like I'm like, I don't mean to be arguing for the Common Core, I'm just trying to explain it to you. And so like, where do you, like, I don't know, any suggestions on places we can point people to try to help make it clear that
welcome to my world
neutral.
where we're bipartisan, and we don't take a position on Common Core, but the moment that I open my mouth and try to describe it, then I am all of a sudden a Common Core opponent and pro-opponent. Like, I get attacked by both sides no matter what I say.
Yeah, we're getting criticized constantly for being like, oh, well, clearly you're in the Common Core camp. And it's like, we're just trying to tell you what it is.
Yeah.
Can I give a little food for thought. It's something to consider. Because so, as a teacher, I've been teaching to common standards almost my whole career. And so those common standards went from, the Minnesota Profiles of Learning to Minnesota Academic Standards to, in the English Language Arts world of Minnesota, the Common Core state standards that were adopted, right? So, if, part of it is perhaps offering some historical perspective that common standards have been around for a while. Some states probably longer than others, and so is it, I don't feel that as advocacy for common standards to just state the history or offer some historical context at some time. That, again, you'll find teachers and administrators and others who have been around common standards and a common standards movement for a long time. Mm-hmm. And that may help. So I'm just going to throw that out there as one way I also try to frame discussions I'm having with teachers and families around common standards as well.
I would also say, just as a reporter, this is not a glamorous response, but I think, as Carolyn has suggested, boilerplate. Get your boilerplate down. Think like an attorney. Say, okay, I have to write another Common Core story. I'm going to plug this in, right? Maybe vary it depending on the situation, what you're writing about. But there are straightforward ways to put this, and you can put your little personalized touch on it. But I think it is helpful for folks to have that to plug in and just feel comfortable with it, frankly, so you're not worrying about it when you're writing about it, so it doesn't take your time away from other valuable things. So you're not thinking about, well, what was the federal government's role back in 2010? God, what happened? So yeah, I think that's an important thing that you can do for yourself as well. Be good to yourself, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Because you're smart enough and good enough. Gosh darn it.
Hi, Erin Richards, Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. I'd like to talk more about the implications of states that basically bar the results of these new state tests from counting for accountability purposes or teacher evaluations. There's a bill in Wisconsin right now that's pending that would basically untether the test scores from our accountability state report cards, which of course flies in the face of our waiver from No Child Left Behind. First question is Oklahoma the only state that has sort of undergone the removal of the waiver? What are the implications of that, and how many more states are we going to see, and what's actually going to happen when you lose your waiver?
Well, just to answer that quickly, Washington State is the other state that has lost its waiver, and unlike Oklahoma, it has not gotten it back. There are efforts underway to try and get it back. But just to address that point quickly, Washington State is another where you can look at that situation.
Yeah, and Oklahoma got their waiver back. So they lost it because the department illegally required them to have college and career ready standards as a condition of getting a waiver. And so when they pulled back from the Common Core, they needed to immediately have their higher education system certify that their old standards are college and career ready. That took a while because most people thought they probably weren't. But eventually the higher ed system said they were, and then they got their waiver back. So
I think illegally some people would debate that, but I do think there is something...
that was definitely an opinion.
So just to the point of
big picture, guys.
There was I think there was a sense that what happened in Oklahoma was sort of pro forma on the department's half, and there was a sense that, well, we don't really want to take away your waiver. We don't want to do that. And as Mike said, they got their waiver back.
I would. Formal consequences would be for Oklahoma to go back under No Child Left Behind sanctions. So every school would be failing everyone, and no one has the appetite to do that. So my guess is that enforcement just would not have happened. That's my impression.
For Wisconsin, it depends what we mean by untethering accountability. I mean, they would certainly, if they no longer reported the test scores or rated schools based on the test scores, sure, that would be against No Child Left Behind. They could lose their waiver. If they simply say, we're going to have a pause in terms of intervening in failing schools or in tethering this to teacher evaluations, that I think they could be okay with. Hey, and by the way, the House is having a big debate on the floor today on No Child Left Behind reauthorization. So within a few days, we're going to have a new law.
It is actually ESA reauthorization.
Yeah, yes. I was kidding about the in a few days, but we may have a new law sometime.
It's possible.
Right.
And what has been happening too, and this is one reason why we need something reauthorized on the federal level, is that the department and states have been negotiating between themselves on where there's some flexibility within the waiver, within a state's individual waiver. So we're having this very individual, compartmentalized federal law being applied to the states. And one could argue that perhaps not equally or fairly the way it probably should be, which is why we need reauthorization.
I think many folks shared Nan's view that this is sort of like the nightmarish version of Let a Thousand Flowers Bloom, where we don't want to have these individual negotiations taking place between the department and states on this constant, uncertain basis. So I think a lot of folks are hoping for the stability that Dan pointed out. Other questions?
I guess I'm going to ask you guys to sort of predict the future a bit. So if the opposition against the standards themselves have reached the peak, what are the bills we're going to be seeing from now on? Like, there seems to be a theme in some state legislatures and in the House that, like, a never again type of bill, like, never again are we going to let this happen? And is that enough to appease people? Or will it be like a cost thing with the test? Like, will people move away from the test because of the cost, et cetera?
One thing, I'll just take a shot at this real quick, because one of the joys of my job is reading lots and lots and lots of bills, hundreds. And I've had the joy of reading just about every single repeal bill in the country. But I would say that what I've seen is there's about 3 different kinds of repeal bills. They're just it's a very short bill. It says, no, the Common Core cannot be implemented in the state. Then there's, on the other spectrum, something that we saw in Ohio in the fall last year, or where they get really detailed about what it's going to look like after post Common Core. And then there's something interesting that Oklahoma did, and they're the only state to do this. The legislature previously had the right to review the standards, but they gave themselves the right to modify the standards when they come before them again. And the Arizona legislature, the bill that just died, had that exact same provision. So that's where I think it may be interesting. We might see legislatures, as I mentioned before, give themselves a little more say over content, the actual content of the academic standards. But then they still have the work of implementing the standards and all the accountability and assessments that come after. And that's kind of what we're seeing in Indiana, where their legislature right now is dealing with assessments and accountability systems, particularly the assessments this year.
Yeah, I think it's almost inevitable that the Common Core standards are going to become less common over time. I mean, you are seeing states go through some various kinds of review processes, and it makes sense. I mean, eventually, you always need to have a cycle where you look at standards and say, okay, do these still make sense, and is there new evidence and new research that should, cause us to tweak them? It was never figured out way back in 2010 when and if that would happen in a common way. So now you have states doing that individually. And we've seen states already add standards, make some changes. Florida's probably done the most to add a bunch of standards on calculus, on cursive. You're going to see other states do that as well. My sense is they're still going to be 90% the same, but they will diverge over time.
And just to Dan's point about bills, since I like to read bills also, it's okay. If you're looking for an interesting assessment bill in terms of sort of how they handled transition to assessments, Michigan passed a bill that in effect created a test where there are smarter balanced items and also items created by Michigan educators, but only the smarter balanced items count. The items created by Michigan educators are essentially field test items. So I won't get into the details of that, but I don't know to what extent states will sort of follow that route, but I thought that was a very interesting example of how a state, where there was some Common Core pushback, it was an interesting example of how a state handled that. One quick point, and then time for one more question.
My only suggestion to sort of, to predict the future is to continue to watch the confidence level, right? And again, as we're separating things out, watch how people are addressing the confidence level in the standards or of the standards. Are people actually trying to invest in making sure that teachers are confident in the standards and students and families are confident in the standards, legislators are confident in the standards? That's really important. That right now I feel is like our first job. And then I think you see things will fall into place or will completely, I suppose, not fall into place based on the work people are actually doing to address the confidence level people have in the standard.
I think we have time for one more quick question. Is there one from someone with the
Hi, I'm Natalie with the Daytona Beach News Journal in Florida. This question, I guess, could be maybe better suited. I guess there's like an in-action Common Core question, but the reason I ask it now is mostly for Mary Cathryn. I'm interested in hearing your opinion about how much teachers should actually be teaching to the standards in the classroom. And the reason I ask that question now is because I've been in classrooms where you have a fourth grade teacher having the kids pull up the website and looking at the standards and they know exactly what they're doing. Then I've also been in classrooms where you talk to kids, they have no idea what Common Core is. And the reason I ask that now is because I think a lot of times the kids who are like hyper familiar with what Common Core is are going home and talking to their parents about it. Yeah. And that's also skewing parent and public opinion, because then you have parents hearing most of their information about Common Core from their like third grader.
Right.
Good idea,
wow,
bad idea?
That is a great question, and there are lots of disturbing things about that. But so I'll just, like, from a teacher's point of view, right? So I told you I've been teaching to standards for a long time, common standards. And one of the very first things I was taught, and then taught other teachers to do, is to put those standards in kid-friendly language, student-friendly language, right? So 7th and 8th graders are not going to have the standard written up on my board when they walk in the same way maybe a 4th grader would or a 10th grader would, but it's like student-friendly language. So that if another adult walks into the room and says to the student, what are you learning today? It's not, well, I'm learning 12.4.2, you know, like, no. They're saying, well, I'm learning about figurative language today. And so, and then they know what that means, and they know how I'm assessing them on that, maybe short term and long term, etc. And so if kids are going home, and this is why I say, if we're going to pour time into anything, it is this confidence level, and it is what is that experience students are having in the classroom. Because I would sing if I knew students were leaving my class and going home and, you know, having that dinner conversation saying, yeah, Ms. Ricker talked to us today about figurative language, and here's an example, and oh, Dad, you just did that, and you're like, that would make my little English teacher heart flutter. But if they're going home saying, we talked about, you know, Common Core Standard 4.2.7, and here's the worksheet she's having me do, and having me cite in MLA format what the, you know, where I found this example of figurative language in this obscure piece of, you know, not culturally relevant literature, I would, like, that would cause me to do something
Perhaps,
other than sing. So,
perhaps scary, yes.
Yeah. So again, this is why I stress that, like, if we're going to pour energy into anything, it's got to be the confidence of that classroom experience. Because I think if I surveyed membership, I could find both of those experiences. I could find that teacher who is so seamlessly teaching to the standards that students go home and talk about the content and talk about what they learned. And I could probably find a teacher who is so sort of like, again, thrown, you know, here's the website, go at it, where the teacher's like, oh my gosh, the students have to know what they're, so I'm going to like give them the standard itself, and it's, you know, and it's going to be a miserable conversation on the way home.
That's a good place to end it, I think. I didn't mean that ironically. But thank you all for your time and for chatting with these folks. I hope it was helpful.
Thank you.